right. Good. Good morning, everyone. We've heard already a little bit about DSA implementation and everything that is to come now. We've heard a lot over the last months about the protection of children online as part of the DSA, and for good reason, of course. Young people, teenagers, spend much of their time online and many hours per day on platforms, particularly social media. Of course, that allows them the opportunity to explore, to connect, but unfortunately research shows that it also exposes them to harmful content, affects their mental health, and maybe even exposes them to risks of exploitation. So the question is, how can we make sure that platforms bring out the best for young people while protecting them from the worst? So in this panel, we want to discuss that and specifically, of course, focus on the DSA obligations for minors and the guidance that we're expecting from the European Commission on protection of minors. So what can we expect from these guidelines? What can we expect from platforms to really change to make things better for minors online? So I'm very happy to introduce our panelists of today. First, we have Leanda Barrington-Leach. She's the executive director at 5 Rights. We have Martin Harris-Hess, head of section. Head of Sector Protection of Minors at DG Com at the European Commission. We have Tim Stok, Director of Public Affairs at Tencent. Karen McAuley, Director of Policy for Children at Coimisiún Meán, and Michèle Ledger, of course, who we've already heard at CERRE and University of Namur. So thank you very much for being here today. Michèle has already introduced that we've sort of focused on age assurance and age-appropriate design. Before diving into these topics, I first would like to ask you for your views on what we can expect from the guidelines. And first, I'd like to ask you, Martin, the Commission's perspective. We know that the DSA obligations on protection of minors are relatively broad or somewhat open. During our discussions at the forum, we've seen that some say, well, you cannot just come and introduce new obligations for measures with these guidelines, but at the same time, we're of course hoping for very concrete things that platforms should be doing. So what can we expect from the guidelines?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to present something that is not yet in the public, but soon will be. First of all, I often hear, how can we increase the effort of platforms to kind of protect children online? And I just want to make clear, I don't like the word effort in this respect because it reminds me of my school days when the report said, oh, he tried very hard, which usually meant he didn't deliver. The DSA and the obligations in the DSA on the protection of minors are delivery obligations. So you have 2 parts. One is the risk framework for the very large online platforms, which is under the supervision of the European Commission, where the requirement is to put in place effective mitigation measures, including vis-à-vis the systemic risks that I mentioned in an article before in 34, that includes the protection of minors, that includes fundamental rights, the rights of the child, but also the physical and mental well-being of users of these services. And then this is, I guess, the topic for today, the obligation on all online platforms in Article 28.1, which is an obligation to ensure a high level of protection. So it's not just to try and get there, but to actually deliver. We recognize that this article is, as you said, phrased in a very broad manner. I think this is necessary because of the diversity of platforms that we see. It's very difficult to encode in law a kind of an obligation that fits this ecosystem that is very diverse. That's why the legislator added to the provision the power for the European Commission to issue guidelines. And what we're trying to do is exactly what you described, to try and strike the balance between kind of catching everything and being as concrete as possible to lead to tangible results. So what the guidelines will attempt to do, and we are banking here a little bit, as I think Maria made the point very good, this is not an effort by one or even a group of regulators, but by society at large. Is that when we come out with a public consultation in the next few weeks, that we also elicit kind of feedback from civil society, from academics. I think your paper is very helpful in this respect, that we then use to improve our proposal and hopefully come out with a product that is very good. The guidelines as such will cover a broad range. As I said, this is, I think, necessary given the wide variety and diversity of platforms. At the current draft, and I'm not sure this will definitely be the one that goes into public consultation, but the current draft has, I think, over a dozen chapters. What we try to do is going through a user journey from you know, the governance of the platform to you know, account setup, content moderation, recommender systems, age verification, age assurance is a big topic, of course. Generative AI is in everyone's mind. User support measures, just to name a few. I don't want to go through the whole list now, but and under each chapter we have a set of concrete recommendations that we would expect platforms to take, depending on the type of service they provide. Of course, we don't expect every platform to implement every single recommendation, because some of them might not be fit for the way they operate or their business model, but we would expect them to understand how their service impacts the safety, security, and privacy of children, and then adapt the measures that we recommend to their service. I think I'll leave it here and we can come back.
Thank you. So, Karen, from the national perspective, we've talked about that sometimes protection of minors is understood as ensuring children's safety and security online, but it's a broader thing, of course. When we look at it holistically, it's also about children's rights and opportunities online. So, what does that mean in practice for implementing the DSA obligations or for the guidance?
Thank you very much. Maria has very kindly done the tough work of trying to introduce Coimisiún Meán in some words earlier on, so I won't repeat what she said. But one of the things I might add, Maria mentioned, just to kickstart this, I might mention, is that Maria mentioned that we'll be publishing our inaugural strategy shortly, and it contains 6 strategic outcomes, one of which relates to children, and that's consistent with the way Coimisiún Meán has been thinking since our establishment, by which I mean the children have been a top priority for us in our thinking in terms of how we've organised ourselves, who we've recruited, and the work that we've been putting, I suppose, front of mind. And that outcome is about, all our outcomes are purposefully aspirational, but it's about working towards a media landscape, including an online media landscape, where children's rights, development and well-being are upheld together with their safe engagement with content. And the reason I'm saying all of that, I suppose, is that's very much the lens and perspective that we've been bringing to our engagement with Working Group 6 on the protection of minors. As Maria mentioned, we're vice chair of that working group. And one of the things that we've been very keen to highlight on an ongoing basis through our engagement with the work to develop the guidelines, our participation in Working Group 6, is the importance of taking a holistic approach, as you mentioned. And by that we mean a child-centred, rights-based approach which recognises both the opportunities that children can experience in the online environment in terms of enjoyment of their rights, but obviously also the risks, the serious risks in some cases that environment presents to their rights, including their protection. And in terms of a holistic approach, we tied very much to the principle of proportionality, and really that's about saying Article 28 expressly focuses on online platforms accessible to children having an obligation to ensure, and that's a big word, ensure a high level of privacy, safety and security for children. And our view on it is really that measures directed towards that, and what the guidelines say in that regard, need to ensure that focus has regard to the best interests of children and to the rights of children in the round. So I think that's going to be critical to the way we move this forward. The other piece I'd say is that we've been thinking, and I hope it's all right to talk about this, Martin, but in Working Group 6 in our deliberations, we have given quite a lot of attention to the whole question of how the guidelines can promote measures and approaches that include a clear focus on children's best interests as a primary consideration and have due regard to children's rights in the round. And one of the areas that we've been looking at is the whole area of child impact assessment, allowing that if you're looking to ground the best interests of the child in practice, you need to look at it through the lens of children's rights and the impact of children's rights. So I suppose in brief, in terms of we've been talking a lot. We've brought experts in to Working Group 6 meetings to look at how we can integrate a holistic view of children's rights within the guidelines and promote accordant measures by the platforms that will fall within scope.
Thank you. So we've heard already quite a lot today, actually, that it's going to be an effort of society and changing social norms, and it's not just making a law. But ultimately, it's going to be the industry that then also has to make changes and adopt measures. So Tim, I turn to you. What would be some of the biggest challenges in actually making sure that the interests of the child are ensured on a platform?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Miriam. So indeed, I think, obviously we're all, let me start out by thanking everyone in CERRE for being able to sit here on this stage. I was one of those kids when Martin said, back at school when, I was one of those children as well that was really pushed to, you're doing a good job, best effort. I guess we made it. We're on the panel together here, so, we got somewhere. But I think, to your question about, what does, let me start also with Tencent. For those of you who don't know, it's a large international technology and entertainment company. We're all about making connections, whether that's through video games or whether that's through WeChat, one of the social messaging apps that we do, or digital content that comes from international markets to China. But we're here to talk about minors and DSA. So I think we're all anxiously waiting the DSA guidance for protection of minors. The one thing, and that's why I'm pretty reassured by what Martin already said, is that I would highlight, take that risk-based approach. Not all platforms, not all online content is the same for children. We're talking about earlier about porn. And I'm here mainly to represent the video games from that angle. And obviously, yes, there are things that we might need to improve as video game sector, but it's a completely, totally different sort of category of online entertainment. So I think that would be the recommendation that the video game sector also gives to the Commission. Don't conflate all sectors, all online platforms, being one and the same. I think that would be the message to pass on. So that would also be, if obviously that would become a challenge, if that isn't the case. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, thank you. So we are dealing, of course, with a lot of different types of platforms, different types of services. We have this overarching law and now many efforts to try and make this workable and effective for the many different services that we have. So having heard now sort of what we can expect from the policymaker side and what the challenges also will be from the industry side, I would turn to Leanda. What would 5 Rights like for the guidelines to achieve? We've discussed throughout the forum that it should not be an afterthought sort of to protect minors, especially on platforms, of course, that are used a lot by minors. So what should we expect concretely to change for platforms or on platforms based on the DSA and its guidelines?
Thank you very much. Is this working? Just question volume? There we go. Hello, delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. 5 Rights is an international NGO, for those of you who don't know, working specifically on children's rights in the digital environment. We do research, policy, and we create tools, practical tools, both for regulators and for corporates. So your question is indeed what can they do and what do we expect, what does civil society expect from the guidelines? Well, I would say that, I'm not going to go into the detail about what the problems are. I think if you don't know, I did bring some of our research with me, but they are many and they are really fundamental and they're based on platform design. Right, so there are bad actors out there, but we do have a digital economy which is very much exposing children to risk by their system design. Then I'd like to say that just 5 years ago, this was not on the agenda at all. So I want to recognize that we, as a community, and when I say as a community, I mean as civil society, as researchers, as regulators, as parents, as the broader caregiving community, we've come an awful long way in this time. And we've set a real challenge, and I think what we've seen with the Digital Services Act and this conversation today is that there is a real willingness to get to the root of the problem. We also know that platforms can and will change in response to good regulation. We've seen it first with the Age-Appropriate Design Code in the UK. There were the Irish fundamentals, also the French, the Swedish, the Dutch. There have been a lot of good things coming out, and we've seen a lot of changes made in anticipation and further to the DSA and the AI Act also coming in. But as was said in the introductory remarks, we also see that this is very, very clearly being challenged, right? So we're at a very, very critical moment, challenged, of course, by the companies themselves, also now by the new US administration, and indirectly challenged by, indeed, the pressure for innovation, jobs, growth, which I would say are very much not in contradiction with what we're trying to do. On the contrary. So I would say what the guidelines need to achieve, they really need to achieve what it says on the tin. Article 28 is very clear. It puts the responsibilities on platforms, right? So not on parents, not on users, on platforms, to ensure a high level of privacy, safety, and security. And as Martin says, to deliver that. Now, I would say that, in doing so, this is a question of not reviewing the social norms, coming back to what was said in the fireside chat, but I think it's about defending social norms. We can go into detail afterwards about what exactly the guidelines should do to do that. But I think as civil society, we did put out a year ago already an overview of what we saw as the baseline for these guidelines. So we're very, very clear on what we expect to see there. But I just wanted to say that it really is a question. It is of process, it is of due diligence, so it is of making efforts, but set against certain outcomes. So it's about delivering the right outcomes based on children's rights. And in doing so, I just wanted to emphasize, this is not a question of changing social norms. It really is a question of coming back to basics, defending international law, children's rights, and what we already have in place, and bringing this sector into the more normal process of how we have always regulated innovation to date. We've had a bit of a Wild West moment, and yes, the way we are working in this current digital economy, that does need to change. So the current status quo needs to change, but it is not a question of changing what we expect in our society, but coming back and making sure that these companies are playing by our democratic rules.
So maybe I just quickly follow up before I turn to Michèle already on that, because I see what you mean, right? We need to go back to basics or reinforce social norms. We do see, though, that certain things have become normal. Like I said, teenagers spending so much time online, and we now we have started to see the impact of that, right? Just on a very basic level, I would just be bored when waiting for the bus as a teenager. But at this point, of course, teenagers they're used to getting all their information and entertainment in these little snippets, and teachers are complaining that they are not concentrating anymore. What I'm trying to get at is that, right, there are certain things that you can legislate, things that are really illegal, or certain content that shouldn't reach users. But the issues seem to be sort of bigger than that, right? And we have already gotten to the point. Not everything can be done with a law. But so how do we then return to these social norms, and what role can the DSA and its guidelines play in that? Or is it then ultimately still also an issue for parents and educators, and something that not platforms can fix on their own? Because ultimately they will want to make money, right? And it is at some point at odds with users not spending so much time on them, right? So how do you see this?
That's getting really to the crux of it, and I'm glad that you do, and I'll be really interested to hear from everyone else as we follow up the conversation. But I think, you really did say it, we used to get bored, right? We used to pay attention. The problem now is that, and this is really, it's a basic developmental issue. It's a basic issue with the development of children's brains. We have a problem if kids never get bored, if they're permanently scrolling, right? And leading to what they themselves call brain rot. We have a problem if they come to university and they can't pay attention. And I'm sure some of the researchers in the room might be able to speak to this. We have a problem, right? And kids themselves know this, parents know this, teachers know this. So I really think, when you say it isn't all of society and it's affecting all of society. And there is a role, of course, for kids to recognize this, for parents to recognize, to do something, to stand up. And they are. Parents are standing up. Teachers are standing up. Caregivers are standing up. Psychologists are standing up. Everyone is playing their role and they're willing to play this role. But there is a massive discrepancy here with the power of these platforms and what they, it's not just any information technology, right? The reason we call it persuasive design, deceptive design, manipulative design, there is a reason they're making money by influencing, by taking time, taking attention, the attention economy, and influencing behavior. It's fundamentally different. And we're doing this to kids who are who do not yet even have the control mechanisms to manage it. I mean, I'm not saying it's good for adults, but I'm saying that it is fundamentally, if you want a knowledge economy, for example, you want Europe to be an innovative knowledge economy, then stop destroying the brains of our children will be a good start.
Thank you. Thank you.
Miriam, can I just add to that?
Yes.
After this,
Michèle, I will get to you.
look, I personally, I couldn't agree more with what Leanda said. I think that's so important to have that generation of people, of kids that just know what boredom is and what and I think the role of parents is so important as well. And that's, if you look at video games, there's lots of emphasis on how we can ensure a healthy gameplay. And the role of the parents in all of this is pivotal. So, example that Tencent did was it was organized very simple. It's organizing an evening where parents and their teenage kids play video games together. And when you know what the content that your kid is playing or viewing or listening to, that's the first step. And I think that there is, I think civil society, NGOs, industry, lawmakers, they all have one thing in common, or apart maybe from the Gen Zs, but they're all parents. So I think that, and they have an impact on their children. And when we talk about just not looking at your phone the whole day, I think parents also have to set the right example. So that means putting your phone away every now and then when you're having dinner with your kids.
Yes, that starts early, I can say, with a 3-year-old at home who already notices when we are on the screen. So let me take the discussion then back maybe a little bit now also to the policy-making part here. So Michèle, you've already mentioned that one of the things that you found is sort of the fragmentation with national authorities and national regulators adopting policies. So, and we've also already heard a lot, well, age assurance is a nice idea, but how to enforce it, right? We hear every now and then, like this country is going to say social media only from 15 onwards, or something like that, and then a lot of others saying that's nice, but how are you going to enforce that? So what have you found in terms of what are the challenges here, or maybe also the opportunities to really make age assurance happening? Because of course everything that happens once a child is on the platform is one part, but the other is that especially for the very problematic platforms or websites is keeping children off altogether. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have got a major problem in Europe at the moment, in the EU, in the sense that there are so many countries that are moving towards adopting legislation and enforcing their regulators to prevent children from accessing pornography platforms and other particularly harmful content. So there is a real problem. There's no point in just sort of sitting there saying, okay, there's a problem in terms of the functioning of the internal market. So, and that is directly caused, I think, by the fact that the DSA does not provide sufficient guidelines or is not sufficiently forceful in addressing those issues. And so I think that we should definitely seek to put an end to that national fragmentation. And I know it's not easy, because I know the EU is a collection of member states with different legal traditions and cultural sensitivities. But still, when you see that, say, there are at least 5 or 6 or 7 countries now that are moving in that direction, I think we should acknowledge the fact that there are certain types of services that should not be accessed by children, and that should be made extremely clear at the EU level, and we should stop that national fragmentation. Now, what I also see at the national level is that the laws also have a very wide scope of application, in the sense that they don't only cover online platforms as we define them in the DSA, but they go wider than that, right? which is not logical because it's not only online platforms as defined that have problematic content. So we have got a fundamental problem as well in that respect. So I really think that something should be done at EU level because we're losing grip, basically. And that's what I would like to see happen, because I'm a strong believer in the EU, and I think we would be much stronger if we had a very clear position on the protection of minors on some very targeted aspects that we could also then start negotiating with other parts of the globe and be a real partner in that respect, not just showing Article 28 and risk assessments and, oh, we don't quite know what we should be doing in relation to stopping children from accessing the really nasty content. So that I'm on one hand a bit cross, and I don't know how to. That's the message that I want to put across in the paper, at least. I mean, there's lots of other things as well, but that's the main message.
Thank you so much. So Karen, from the national perspective then, knowing that you, of course, cannot fix this internal market issue, but when it comes to implementation, do you believe it's the technical limitations that are the biggest challenge, or is it maybe the scope issue that Michèle mentioned? Your colleague Maria also already pointed out you're coming from this broader media perspective. We do have the DSA on platforms, but some of these issues are broader than platforms. So what do you see as the main implementation challenge of ensuring age assurance?
Okay, I think there are quite a few, but what I would say, and maybe it's the optimist in me, I think they're resolvable. And I think it's very important to keep in mind always when we're talking about challenges and complexity, not to minimize that, so just to say this hopefully in a clear way, but to give ourselves permission as human beings to allow that we're quite capable of resolving these things if we want to, albeit it takes time. So just to say that, if that's okay. I think there are a number of challenges, and I mean there isn't time to go through all of them. Picking up on something Miriam was saying during your opening presentation, about the absence of a definition of harmful content and categories of harmful content in the DSA. I think one of the challenges that there is, I suppose, a shortfall in ex-ante rules around the protection of children at EU level, and as a result of that, it's largely been left to national regulators to decide whether and how to define categories of harmful content. So, for example, our founding legislation at national level, the Online Safety and Media Regulation Act, does specify certain types of content as harmful, with particular reference to children. And that has informed our work to develop our online safety code at national level and the transposition of the AVMSD through it, or completion of that transposition. But the reason I say that is, until we have a shared understanding grounded in a robust evidence base of what we mean by harmful content, it makes it more challenging to decide which measures to mobilise and when, what's proportionate, what's appropriate, what's effective, including age assurance. So there's a missing piece in the puzzle there that I think is a bit of a barrier. The second piece, I think more generally, and I think this applies to regulators as well as regulated entities, is there's quite a range of considerations, and they're complex considerations that come into play when one's thinking about how to implement age assurance effectively and what methodologies to deploy, because there's a range of methods available, we know, with different levels of certainty and accuracy attached. But the kind of things I'm talking about is the need for us as regulators, and then also for regulated entities, to think about identifying and implementing methods that uphold the fundamental rights and legitimate interests of users, including the rights of children, the importance of implementing methods that are proportionate to the harm caused by unrestricted access to content, and doing so in such a way that doesn't inhibit or unduly limit children's access to quality content. I'm talking about having to think about methods that are accurate in their use, that are fair, that mitigate against circumvention, which I know is a concern of many, that are privacy preserving and uphold data protection obligations, and then also that are accessible, easy to understand and easy to use. So those considerations, one can come up with a list, but translating that list into solutions that work well for users and that are compliant with regulation, I think is difficult. Just one more point, if that's okay. The other thing I think is that one needs to look at age assurance in context. I think there's broad consensus, I hope there is, that age assurance is not a silver bullet and it's not a standalone measure. So one of the things one needs to think about when you think about effectiveness of age assurance and challenges around implementation is around how age assurance interacts with other measures that are designed to support children's safe engagement online.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot of different levels where we need to think about what age assurance means and how it can be helpful. So to you then, Tim, because then how to make sense of all this, right? So we're having different rules being implemented by member states with different scopes. Then we have indeed the question of, age assurance is not just verifying somebody's age to give them access to the platform, but then it's also about what type of content or contacts they have access to once on the platform, which requires basically judging and evaluating what type of content is appropriate. Then we have children with different ages, with different things that might or might not be appropriate. Now I know for you, right, this is one thing for example, social media, for e-commerce, but maybe in gaming, it might be somewhat more straightforward in the sense of a particular game, a particular age or something like that. Like, what would you say with all these different levels of where we have to think about what age assurance means, how to do that in practice for you? And then on one of the substantial issues that Karen also mentioned, privacy versus security, if we can think of it like that, how to make sense of that in practice for a platform like Tencent or a company like Tencent?
Yeah, sure. I think, again, coming back to from the angle of video games, there's what we need, obviously, besides the EU-wide scalable solutions, are proven solutions. Build on stuff that's working well. And if we look at video games, there's two things to highlight. PEGI is the age rating and content descriptor system, the Pan-European Games Information. It's been in place since the early 2000s. It's now covering more than 40 countries across Europe. And it distinguishes games that are appropriate for under 3, or up till 7, or all the way up to 18. And I think that's the starting point that gives some kind of guidance on parents for when they're purchasing video games and that their kids should play. And not just the age, but also content descriptors, as in there's violence, there's drugs, and those content descriptors also, again, guide and help the parents and ultimately ensure that the game player, and these are kids as well, that they enjoy playing the video game. So besides PEGI, which is a very successful self-regulatory approach that the industry took responsibility in implementing. Obviously, it was nudged by the Commission to do so back in early 2000s. I would also highlight parental controls in games that are easy to switch on. So think of time limits on a particular for screens and on your laptop or on your mobile, or spending limits. And a lot of these games also Tencent that the default is when we talk about chats within games, to turn those off for minors that are playing, right? And building a system where that would be the default in those games, I think is also the starting point, and you can build from that. So these are two very successful measures that the industry has taken, and that's been working well. So I would say, build on that, and I think that's important to take into account.
Thank you. So you've mentioned default, so that might be a good way to now move more towards this age-appropriate design. Of course, recognizing this is all part also of age-appropriate design, right? Also many aspects of age assurance, but thinking more broadly about the things that platforms can and should be doing, the measures they should be taking to really make things different. So Martin, I would first turn to you here. We've heard defaults in the reports. We've also talked about technical things to really change versus governance. You've mentioned we have many different platforms, different types of services, different age groups. So how can we come up with guidelines, or how are you approaching that are concrete enough for platforms to kind of really then know what is supposed to be done, but also general enough to cover these many different services? What concretely can we think of in terms of defaults or maybe other types of measures to be taken?
Very good question, thank you. And if you allow me, I would like just to come back on age verification and age assurance, because I like Michèle well enough to make her less cross. so what we will try and do in the guidelines is what you suggested, is that we set, and also this goes to the risk-based approach, that we set out scenarios, and I fully acknowledge that we cannot define harmfulness of content in a set of guidelines that is about safety. But what we can do is where we say there is a societal acceptance that this type of content is too harmful for children to access, and we give examples, pornography is one of them. We would expect age verification to happen to avoid this harm to materialize, and then we set out in which scenarios it is. And the DSA as a maximum harmonization tool would then expect member states to follow this, because it's a maximum harmonization. So this hopefully puts an end to the national solutions, the differing national solutions on this particular topic. So I just wanted to say this before we come to age-appropriate design. But this is also an important thing. I think Karen mentioned it at the outset. One of the things we discussed in Working Group 6, and that will flow into the guidelines, is that we will ask the platforms, before they provide their service to children, to carry out an assessment of how their service impacts safety, security, and privacy of those children. And then we will hopefully add a template that guides those platforms, because we understand that this might be a process. We want to make it as easy as possible for platforms, especially since there are a lot of smaller platforms that might not have the regulatory compliance capacities that the very large ones have. And then based on this assessment, we would expect them to have a better understanding how to design their service in order to address the particular risks that that their own platform has for children. And then in the guidelines, we will set out under the headings I said earlier, a number of recommendations that go to privacy and safety by design and by default. So that are not reactive measures on content moderation, for example, but they are actually built in the provision of the service from the outset to avoid this harm to actually materialize. There are a large number of different approaches, but I just take 3 examples here to illustrate this. So one is on recommender systems. Our research has shown that a lot of the issues that we face in terms of risks for children stem from the fact that recommender systems are based on maximizing engagement and solely on maximizing engagement. For children, we think this is the wrong approach, and that's why we say when you are accessible to minors for the provision of your service to minors, your recommender system should take this into account and use, for example, active signals from the child. I don't like this content, this makes me feel horrible, or something like this, and build this in how content is shown on the feed, for example, or how content is recommended. We hope that this kind of contributes then to a more positive kind of content delivery for the child. Others are functionalities that increase the user agency, and the interactions are enabled, so that they are enabled by default, so that children are able to choose in a much better way, that give the user the opportunity to think before they decide, and don't kind of are drawn into this kind of negative spirals. And then a third example is that minors are not exposed to persuasive design features, and that also includes, automatic scrolling, autoplay content, and things like this that get them into this spiral of kind of being drawn into the consuming content on a continuous level, and often harmful content. So these are kind of 3 examples that we have amongst many where we think the answer is in the way the service is designed, not necessarily a reactive measure to things. And just because it was mentioned as well, I think well-designed parental control tools are a complementary measure that will help to deliver, but they cannot be the only measure, and they definitely are not the answer to an obligation on platforms to ensure safety, security, and privacy, to basically say, oh, here's a tool, you parents, you're going to do this.
Thank you. So many things here to pick up on. One is indeed that I mean, asking for platforms basically don't try to keep users online as long as possible, right? That is really sort of directly at odds with how they make money. And so that would then have to be quite sort of that's then a concrete thing that we can expect them to do, and that would be something like an enforceable. You get a fine if you do try and keep users online for longer, right? So that would be, I think, a big change. So one thing is, of course, the way in which platforms are designed, the way in which they recommend content. The other is then the content itself, and that then indeed brings us to harmful content. Michèle already picked up on that as well. The DSA there are good reasons for that, right? Illegal content must be removed. With harmful content, it's much more about the procedural and risk assessment, risk mitigation approaches. But still then, it comes down to what kind of content should users be seeing. And the difficulty is also that one video might not be harmful, but it's also harmful to be exposed time and time again to the same type of content, and this whole filter bubble issue, right? Colleagues of mine are doing some research with minors, and it's really interesting to see how they then go, wow, okay, so these girls in my class are really seeing a completely different world online than I am, and they might not even be aware of that this is happening. So again here, many different levels at which we need to do something. The design in terms of defaults, but then also the substance of content. So then back to you, Leanda. So, and again, on this point of we need to think of child-appropriate design at the outset, not as an afterthought. What concretely are you or is 5Right suggesting that platforms should be doing? Is that in line mostly with what Martin has said, or additional things to consider?
Thank you. Yes, I think we're quite in line with what Martin's saying, so very happy to hear all of that, and looking forward to the draft guidelines to see if all the detail is there. I just want to come back on a few points. First of all, we shouldn't talk about, age assurance and age-appropriate design as separate. The whole point of age assurance should be able to know your customer and design appropriately for them, right? I mean, and of course, it's disingenuous to suggest that most of these platforms don't know the age of their users, because they generally do. But so the age-appropriate design, so the age assurance, should not really be, just about a default shutting them out. If it's content that is illegal, or if it's platforms that are designed around things that are illegal, at least for children, and so not just porn, but also things like gambling, then it's obvious, based, I think, on existing law, that there should be some kind of age gating there. But otherwise, age assurance should be about recognizing children on the service, recognizing whether you're talking about a 6-year-old or a 16-year-old, and designing appropriately for them. So that should be the use of age assurance. It should be something positive. It shouldn't be about shutting them out. It could be used also, it should be understood selectively. So you don't need to close children off an entire platform. You might have certain, features or functionalities of the platform that are risky, but you think are valuable for certain users, and so you put them in, but you then put age verification or something robust in place to ensure that children don't use them. So just that point, why do we do age assurance should be for that. Second thing, I'm not going to repeat what Martin said, but again, it should not be about the parents. Parental controls, can be useful. Digital literacy can be useful, but that is not what Article 28 is about. It is about the actual platform responsibility, and not pushing that back onto parents, because as we all know, parents have been trying for an awfully long time and it's not working. By the way, I heard the other day, I don't know if these figures are correct, but Google said that in their research they find that parents are spending between 4 and 12 hours a week on trying to manage their children's screen time. Now I ask you, is that normal? And those are figures from Google, so So coming back, it's not about parents, it's not just about, age gating, and thirdly, it's not just about content, right? It's even not primarily about content. Content in itself, not illegal content, but, trying to define what is harmful, and as you say, one thing, might not be harmful once, but then if it keeps coming back, it might cause a problem. Focusing on content is highly problematic. Focusing on content then gets you into problems of free speech, etc. It'll make this conversation and this argument continue forever. We're not going to find the solution if we're focusing on content. Now, when it comes to content, one thing that we often say is that, it is not, for example, knowing how to commit suicide in itself is not the problem. Information about eating disorders is not the problem. You can find all of that on platforms such as Wikipedia or dictionaries and things. That's not the problem. The problem is if you're being pushed it. So the problem is the system design. The problem is the recommender system. The problem is the algorithms. The problem is the dark patterns. The problem is the business model that encourages these pieces to be put in place, right, for profit. That is the problem. So this is what the system, this is what we absolutely have to get at, which is why we're talking, privacy is about data minimization, right? Don't collect the data to start with. Don't collect it. Don't use it to profile kids. Don't use it to push stuff back at them. Don't use it to create, their rabbit holes and things that are going to keep them online the longest possible. That is privacy, right? Privacy is not, did you check a cookies banner? That's not privacy. Privacy is allowing you privacy in your head, allowing a company to stay out of your head, right? And not start collecting all of this information and inferring all of this stuff about you so that they can, keep you online and keep you engaging and pushing advertising at you. That is privacy. Safety, indeed. It is about not recommending strangers. It is about turning geolocation off. So it's absolutely about by design and default. It's about those settings, and I'm really glad, Tim, that you said, indeed, by default. It's about having them there, and not, that parents can click them all off. It is about that the system is designed, to be safe, to be private, to be secure from the start, and not counting on anyone, let alone children, understanding how to protect themselves and navigate. And again, I don't want to go into all the detail, but it is there online if you want.
Thank you so much. So you've mentioned, and you as well, Martin, the recommender systems, that it's also about how the content is pushed, about the algorithms. So sort of a development, of course, over the last years that's come on top of everything is the rapid development of also, not just from the side of platforms using algorithms or maybe AI systems, but also bots and maybe malicious actors using AI to push all kinds of fake content, or sort of raising this additional question of what is real, what is not. So here I'd like to ask to all of you, AI-generated content obviously poses a big problem. At the same time, AI may also be able to help platforms to detect harmful content or to improve moderation efforts, to make it less necessary to expose humans to all the terrible content that they have to review. So do you see overall AI as a risk or an opportunity when it comes to making platforms safer? Of course, this is broader than minors, but still, who would like to respond to that?
Thanks. I think the answer is already in your question. It is both an opportunity and a risk. Naturally, as regulator, we look probably more at the risks of it. I think, just to come back to the opportunity, I think AI can play an important role in content moderation, as you say, and I think there have been massive improvements even in the last year, where kind of AI-based content moderation has led to better results. But there are also the risks, and in the guidelines at least, one of the more than a dozen chapters that I mentioned earlier is on generative AI and how it impacts the safety of children, if it's included in an online platform, of course, because it has to be within the scope of the DSA. So I think as regulators, naturally, we're looking more at the risks, and there are clearly some risks with this new technology, especially for the younger users of the technology. But it's not just bad, AI. But I just want to do one thing that I actually meant to mention earlier, which is one of the hidden successes of the DSA and other online safety regulation across the world, I think, is the emphasis it places on safety by design. And I've been at a conference last year in Silicon Valley where the safety teams of the platforms came to us and said, thank you for this, because they're all of a sudden heard in the companies. They have a kind of a standing they didn't have before. There's all of a sudden money flowing into their projects because the people who decided about the budget of a platform realize, oh, this is serious, we now need to allocate resources. So I think this is, maybe it doesn't come across in the press so much, but I think this is really an important thing, that safety is taken seriously in the companies now, at least more than it was before. There's still a long way to go. But I think this is due to the regulation being in place, because, these teams now have resources they didn't have before.
Oh, absolutely, and especially with the political developments that we've seen, right? We did have voluntary developments within the platforms, but now we see it's more necessary, I guess, than ever that we do force them. So any other of you, and then I would afterwards come to you, Leanda.
Yeah, I'll give a brief answer to your question, Miriam. I think so. Yeah, definitely, it's both. I think there are social media companies that better address that question on what they're doing to mitigate risk. Again, coming back to video games, and what we're doing at Tencent is indeed applying AI tools to detect languages that could be harmful for minors playing video games, and also to enhance the content moderation. There will always be that human oversight involved in this, and I think that generally also is quite applicable to how can AI help, right? I think it's still at that phase of augmenting rather than replacing human oversight. So that's generally how we apply AI tools in video games.
Maybe just very briefly, I suppose without getting in, I would agree. I mean, yeah, with what Martin says, that the answer to your question is in your question, and that there are opportunities and risks. And of course, you know, to be too heavy-handed about it, but some of the risks that we're seeing are very grave indeed when you're looking at things like AI-generated child sexual abuse material and so on. So it is something that we need to take very seriously. At the risk of, I suppose, speaking in platitudes, I think I'd always go back to the fact that, and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, I think, starts its general comment on children's rights in the digital environment, saying this, is that the digital environment was not designed with children in mind. And I think it's the same for AI and many other developments in this space, is that it hasn't been designed and initiated with children and their best interests in mind. So the challenge when it comes to children and the protection of children in relation to AI and otherwise is to bring children front of mind and their interests front of mind. And I would say that's a choice, you know, but it's a choice that's in our hand. And as regulators, we have a role to put guardrails through implementing, you know, relevant provisions in the DSA and the AI Act and so on. But I think we are at something of a crossroads, perhaps a little bit, hopefully this isn't naive, ahead than we were maybe 10, 20 years ago vis-a-vis other developments in the digital environment.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, during the forum, we've also discussed, right, how some, you know, how offline we have mixed spaces where adults and children use them at the same time. Not everything is necessarily appropriate for children, but of course, we know that online children, are maybe sometimes the primary users of these types of platforms. So, Leanda, then I ask you still as well before I go to just a very quick final round.
Thank you. Yes, I think, you know, AI is supercharging everything, right? So just if you look at so child sexual abuse material, which already, you know, went through the roof in the last decade with, you know, being pushed by links by digital platforms. But now that we have AI-generated CSAM, I mean, again, forget content moderation. Forget it. I mean, there's no way you can deal with this. And yes, I think AI tools are the only way you're going to be able to continue to have any hold on content, on things like that, really illegal content and things. But you know, you cannot do this just by after the fact. In the age of AI, I mean, you know, if you thought that you could, it's too late for that. But when I say supercharged harms, I don't only mean, of course, of that kind of harm. I mean, you know, what is, for kids, we talked about, you know, misinformation, disinformation, we've been talking about for years, like what is truth in the age of, you know, of AI? When we look at the business models, how are they going to fund these business models, right? If you have a chatbot, now these companies that are not making money, when they're looking at what kind of business models they're going to put in place to make money, is that going to be, again, about, you know, ad revenue? The answer is going to depend on who pays the most. Like, where is this going? In any case, what we know is what we already know from the last, you know, decade or two. We absolutely have to, you know, take those lessons into account. The other thing about AI is that it is based on massive data extraction. So, again, you know, we already know this. Where is this coming from? This is coming from, you know, a huge amount of data also from the global south. Let's not forget, it's coming from a huge number of kids also who are already like, you know, one in three internet users is under the age of 18, and they're using, you know, it more and, you know, for longer periods of time often than adults. So I think these are some of the things that we need to consider and that we need to get to grips with. Quite early on. I would just say that last week at Five Rights, we did bring out a children and AI design code, which builds upon the previous work that we have done on the age-appropriate design code, but looks indeed at all of the steps and the criteria and the things that AI designers and regulators need to consider to oversee AI. So I would say yes. There are, of course, opportunities to AI. There are good things, but we need to be very, very careful. And we should not be experimenting on children. And in particular, I'd like to say in the education setting. So this idea that for every AI harm, there's an AI solution, and the AI is going to revolutionize learning, everyone's going to have a personal tutor. Ask education specialists before you start believing this kind of thing. Please, can we go back again to understanding what the outcome we want is, and not just think that every new thing that's thrown on the table is going to be progress.
Thank you so much. So we've heard a lot. So what concretely can we expect, or should we expect, to really change? We're talking about recommender systems, defaults, also, of course, part of content moderation, but also limiting contacts that users are exposed to. We can expect a lot now in terms of implementation to make these things all more concrete. With a view to the time, I would just simply say I would open the floor for a few questions. Let's collect the questions first and then give it back to the panel. So is there anyone who would have a question? I see one in the back there.
Thanks a lot.
I think once you speak, it will turn on.
Okay, is it working? Yes, Zoe Pellegrini from Media for Europe. Thank you very much for the interesting debate. Yeah, my question was on the awareness that parents are having more and more on the risks that these platforms are bringing to children. And do you think it's possible that if these risks are not mitigated by platforms, then parents will stop completely allowing their children online? And could this be actually, an ultimate incentive for platforms to really take these risks seriously? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So let me collect one or two more and then give it back for time constraints. We have one more in the middle in the back. Sorry, James.
Yes, it's just back to this, James Thompson from Cullen International. This point about time spent on services. And I was just thinking, since we have Tencent on the panel and the experience in your home country market of China, I think there were news stories last year about China limiting the amount of time children could spend playing games. And I think, if I'm right, it was that they couldn't play games apart from on Saturday evening. And so, is that true? And any sort of reflections on that and how it could be applied in Europe?
Hi everyone, my name is Matthias Vermeul from AWO. We've heard a lot about age verification solutions, but I was wondering what the panel thought of one very topical policy discussion we're having right now, which is what is the most appropriate level for these age-appropriate or age verification technologies to be rolled out? Is it the platform or the App Store?
Oh, we've talked about this a lot. Okay, so one final short question, and I'll ask for very brief responses from your side.
Hi, this is Ella Jakubowska from EDRI, European Digital Rights. I think my question builds very much on that question. I've been really glad to hear the nuance in this panel around these different solutions. We've done research looking at how all common age verification systems as of the end of 2023 had huge risks around privacy, data protection, profiling, mass collection of biometric data. How are these measures accounting also for the fact that whilst age verification or age assurance can mitigate some risks, it can also create new risks in and of itself? And how are you responding to that?
Thank you so much. So then I'll turn to the panel. So on the first question, is this a collective action problem? All children will say, but my friend is allowed to go online, I should be allowed to go online too. Or can parents manage this on their own? Any of you who would like to very urgently respond to that?
Okay, thank you very much. You know, you're right, parents are rising up. They really are. I mean, I don't know if you've seen all the phone-free school movements around the world, which have had a huge impact. Also, smartphone-free childhood movements, etc. There really are a lot, and they have really helped, I think, you know, parental understanding. So as a way of doing digital literacy and of raising awareness in itself, you know, that has worked. Is it enough? And will parents stop access? Your question was if they don't see results. I think the answer is they're trying, but it's really, really hard. That's the point. They're trying, and even if you manage to go smartphone free in schools, you know. I see it in my son's school. The kid that sits next to him has a watch, you know, and you know, what's it going to be next? So it's just going to be a never-ending discussion. And then, you know, is it just the phone? Is it the computer? As I say, it's really integrated into everything. And then, you know, is it the family device? Is it so? You end up with never-ending questions. You're never going to solve the problem just by trying to end access. So parents have an important role to play. I think that parental pressure is going to push for more change. And for better design, which in the end will be the only solution.
Thank you. So then, Tim, I'll ask you and then finally go to Michèle for the final question. So what about the time limitations?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And indeed, I can confirm that in China, there are time limits for under 18s to play video games. And I'll leave it to this room and everyone online to decide if that's a good or a bad thing. I think we're here today to discuss minor protection in the DSA. And to my knowledge, DSA doesn't apply to China. So I think, you know, let's focus on the discussion on protecting minors in Europe first.
And then Michèle, finally, would you be able to tell us, so we've talked about this as well, right? Age verification as, the new problems that might be coming up, and at which level to do that? Everyone is pointing towards each other sometime, right? There should be somebody else doing that.
Well, I don't know if I can provide a comprehensive answer to that question, but yeah, there are obviously voices that seem to imply that it's at the App Store level that these systems should be deployed. At the moment, I don't think that's not necessarily the right solution. I've seen it spoken about a bit more in Australia, but from the comparative overview that I've conducted. But that's another discussion, I think, and in any case, it's at online platform level that we're talking about it at the moment in Europe, and so maybe Martin can fill us in on that. But there are arguments in both directions, I would say. In terms of the trade-offs that you're talking about age verification, of course, they're very, very important trade-offs, and I've highlighted them in the report, and that's why age verification should certainly not be deployed in a general manner. There are other systems to be able to assess the age of children, and in particular age estimation, which is probably maybe a less intrusive form of technology. So I think if age verification is mandated or highly recommended by the Commission, of course it's because on balance, I suppose, there is a need to prevent children from accessing certain services. And of course, if age verification is mandated, of course all the legal framework that we have in the European Union should be respected, and personal data protection, security, etc. There are huge trade-offs to be had, and of course I would hope then that the European Commission would set some standards and is developing an app on age verification. But of course those standards should be respected and enforced strictly.
Thank you so much. Well, 2 lines. I have to give the floor.
Sorry, just on age verification. So the legal answer is the obligation is, of course, on the provider of the online platform. And that ties into the second part of the privacy part. We are, as Michèle mentioned, we're working on a technical solution for a white label app that then can be localized for member states that takes on board the concerns that Edri mentioned, to develop a state-of-the-art privacy-preserving age verification solution that then can be used in accordance, again, with a risk-based approach for the DSA for the most risky things. I'm not a big fan personally for banning children from social media to protect them. For me, that's victim blaming. I think our ambition should be to make the space safe enough for them to be there and literally have the age verification for when it's absolutely necessary.
I think that's a good point to end on. Let's try to allow users, minors to go there and then have it safe for them. So our hour is up. Thank you very much for joining the discussion today, and thank you for your questions. I'll leave it there and give the floor to the fireside chat now.